Alrighty, so go ahead and pass your exams down this way, and I'll come grab them. And I don't know why there's this awkward aisle. Every time I come in this room, there's something different going on. It's always an adventure. So I will grade these over break. I will not have them by Wednesday. Sorry. There was one year that I gave this like the day before midterm grades were due. So I did it that day and I was exhausting. And I'm just like, nope, need to give myself some breathing time. All right. Where are folks mentally? Would you rather do a case study or have me talk at you? Me talk at you, and we have some videos and stuff. I know that often after people do the exams, they're tired. So I don't mind being the one to do the heavy lifting today because I haven't done my heavy lifting on this yet. So, cool. So we're gonna start. And those of you who are on Zoom, if you can get the test to me today, if I'm not in my office, just shove it under my door. I'm Roop 3. I'm the office closest to the outside door in Roop. So, we're going to start talking about frontal lobe issues. And so, as we've mentioned a lot of times in passing in this class, the frontal lobe is one of the things that makes us sort of most human. It gives us emotions, executive function, which is like organizing things. It gives us the ability to express our personalities and have those differ. And so one of the most famous stories about frontal lobe issues, just gonna see. Okay, that's fine. So I actually, one of the most famous cases here is Phineas Gage, who you probably learned about at least in passing in intro classes. So this is the guy with the rod that went through his brain, basically. And so I actually have some videos that tell his full story, which is a little bit different than what's often told in intro textbooks. And then I also have like the full story that'll flesh it out even more, but I want to show the videos first. So we'll do that.
September the 13th, 1848, near Cavendish, Vermont.
Oh, I should say some of this is a reenactment. So full disclosure, the acting is always that. Because you get the vibe of it at least.
Because a woman agrees to have a toe stepped on for one dance doesn't mean she's in love with you, Jimmy. I suppose you're out here thinking that she's taken by yourself? I'm taking her out tonight. I'll ask her for you. You liar! I have to know that she's visiting her parents tonight. And how do you know that, may I ask? Because she can only see me tomorrow night. I don't believe it. But you can ask her yourself tonight. After it ain't last night. Liar! One more like that, James! James, I'll go after this Dorothy myself.
This is Phineas Gage.
Come on now. Get up there and you start cutting down that brush. Benjamin, you get over here and start leveling off this timber. Off to it. Come on, you lot. What are you looking at? Got a lot of yards to make today. Time's money. Set in there, Billy.
Gage is an intelligent, well-balanced man.
Feeling better now, James? Yeah, that's my boy. You?
He's a modest and reliable person. He's in charge here because he can make careful, well-informed decisions.
All parts of a healthy brain work together. The red emotional limbic system passes on its messages to the blue intellectual frontal cortex, the part of the brain which assigns priorities to the messages.
Everything ready, Billy? Yep. Good. You relax us in, Billy boy. Lock us in. Okay. You're gonna lock us in. I need him, Jamie! Get back there, both at once! As if you want to be working here tomorrow.
Normally, the two brain systems keep thought and emotion in equilibrium.
James? James? Yeah. Good. He's still alive. I'm okay. Come on, help me to my fingers. Oh. I'm sorry. No, I'm okay. I'm sorry. Come on, lads. Let's get him to the village.
Almost a century and a half after Gage's accident, we can guess that his limbic system, frontal cortex, and the connections between the two were damaged by the passage of the tamping iron through his brain. The limbic system is now free to fire emotional messages without the restraint exercised by the frontal cortex.
So this is part of what your frontal cortex does for you, is help you inhibit things. So this is why one of the tests, I don't know if y'all remember because it's been a hot minute since we looked over the assessment stuff, but one of the tests that tests your executive function is the Stroop, where you have to say the name of the color a word is written in rather than reading it. That's really hard to do. And it'd be even harder if you were in Phineas's case where your executive functioning wasn't working that well. So that ability to sort of hold back, self-monitor, that's also one of the things that goes away in issues like ADHD, for example.
But why did Gage feel so little pain? Normally, pain signals move up the spinal column to stations in the brain which pass on the messages to the frontal cortex. At the microscopic level of the neural net, information is passed on from cell to cell. It's through this system that the pain messages reach the frontal cortex. The passage of pain messages occurs partly through a chemical called substance P, which is projected across the tiny gap, the synapse, from one cell to the next. If enough of the chemical reaches the receptors of the next cell, the cell fires and the pain messages continue. Often when pain or stress occurs, endorphins are released. Endorphins are the natural morphines of the brain. Gage's pain was probably lessened by endorphins, diminishing the transmission of substance P across the synaptic gap.
Come on, you can make it, man. Here, take this. It'll help you feel better.
Sometimes just believing in a cure is enough to dampen pain. Water has no pain-killing properties, but it may have given Phineas Gage some relief by triggering the release of more pain-resisting endorphins.
Oh, better.
If Gage had taken morphine, it would have inhibited cell firing by impairing the transmission of substance P, just as the endorphins do, blocking the pain signals.
Hurry, doctor. It's bad. Coming.
The young Edward Williams, a former railroad man himself, was the first doctor summoned.
Can you walk? Yes. Let us through. The man's hurt. Tapping iron went right through his head.
Science's great interest in Phineas Gage was in how the severing of his frontal cortex from his limbic system completely changed his behavior and character.
Come on, Phineas. Let us take you up to bed.
Oh, no. Leave me alone. I just want to stay outside.
Phineas, you'll be better inside.
I'm staying right here! It's Doc Williams. Who?
Doc Williams.
Doc Williams. Here's work enough for you, Doctor.
Gage's words were prophetic. His historic case sparked widespread curiosity into how physical changes in the brain affect behavior.
God, Gage. Arlo. Okay, enough of this nonsense, Phineas. Let's get you off the bed right now. Come on, lift him up. Oh, no. Easy, easy.
So that inappropriate laughter, right? That's a reaction of the frontal lobe being disrupted because emotion is there. We also see inappropriate emotional responses in things like schizophrenia, which also affect this part of the brain.
Samuel. Oh, back to work, eh, boys?
Come on, in the house. Come on.
Come on, easy.
I think I've got the last piece of bones. Want to check, see if there's anything else down there. My right hand is touching my left hand, clear through his head.
Once the connections between the frontal cortex and the limbic system are gone, the limbic system is free to fire its messages of emotion uninhibited by the frontal cortex, and behavior becomes erratic and unpredictable.
You know what I like, Doctor? I like to have my old dog up here. Come here, Biff! Here, boy! Come on!
Keep your head still.
Oh, Billy! Billy! Oh, wait.
Keep your head still.
Oh, I have to see the man, eh? Hey!
Easy, easy. Lie back. Let's see what we can do about your dog, Phineas.
Go get Biff, Billy. Go get Biff, eh? Biff died. Biff, no!
Lie back. Lie back. Surely back.
Against all odds, Gage survived. Physically. But he never did regain his emotional and intellectual self-control, balance, and judgment. His ability to communicate with other human beings decreased, but he developed a special affinity for animals. But for the men Gage used to work with, he had become a man out of control. The balance between his emotions and his intellectual faculties destroyed.
Hey, wait up, man! Hey, don't leave without your foreman, hey! Oh!
Oh. We got a new foreman.
What? Who?
I'm the foreman now.
You? Benjamin. Oh. Oh, you can't take care of yourself, Benjamin, let alone a whole group of men, eh? I'm still in charge, eh?
We hope you'll be back, Phineas. But not today.
Hey, how can you take my job? Phineas Gage! I'm a better man than you, any day! The best foreman!
We'll come by later, Phineas.
I'm the best! I'm the best! No! Not that way! We're still at the cutting! The work's over there, and the explosion! Explosion? Oh. It was not the man that was Gage.
He's like an animal now. An animal's emotions in a man's body.
Gage died 12 years later, still unbalanced. At the Warren Museum at Harvard University, the tamping rod and Gage's skull are preserved, a monument to research into how physical changes in the brain affect behavior. Utilizing the most modern tools of brain science investigation, Doctors Hannah and Antonio Damasio at the University of Iowa Neurology Laboratory have studied Phineas Gage's skull and the tamping rod. They have been able to anatomically determine which areas of his brain were the most seriously damaged.
One thing I'll say really quickly is a lot of intro textbooks also just show this, right? And because of this, when I was in college, I thought the rod just got stuck and he walked around like this for the rest of his life, right? But it actually just went clean through and popped right out, which has its own implications, obviously.
Investigation has revealed major damage to both prefrontal cortical areas, more extensively on the left side. This region is reciprocally connected with the subcortical nuclei involved with emotional processing in the amygdala and hypothalamus. When the prefrontal region is damaged in this way, an individual may not be able to control emotions that originate in these subcortical structures. This was profoundly evident in Phineas Gage.
This is part 2 that's not quite as long here.
When it's crunch time, we've got your back. And your
This is the skull of Phineas Gage, who over 150 years ago became one of the most celebrated cases in the history of medicine, which is why he's still here in the Warren Museum at Harvard Medical School. A smart and likable young man, according to his friends, Phineas was working as the foreman of a railroad construction gang in Vermont when a blasting accident blew this 3-foot-long iron rod through his left cheek and clear through the top of his head. The rod landed about 25 yards behind him, and Phineas got to his feet and walked away. As a local newspaper put it the next day, the most singular circumstance connected with this melancholy affair is that he is alive and in full possession of his senses and free of pain. But while he lived another 12 years with part of his brain destroyed, he was, as his friend said, no longer Gage. He was described as fitful and grossly profane. On the one hand, impatient and obstinate, and on the other, unable to make plans for the future. Unable, in fact, to make up his mind. Phineas Gage's fame stems not only from his simply surviving such a ghastly accident, but because he was the first patient to suggest a link between personality and the functions of the front part of the brain, the frontal lobes. In this show, we're going to explore how our frontal lobes shape who we are and how we go about our lives. What's the area of the brain that was affected during this accident?
Well, I think the area that everybody focuses on is the frontal lobes. Now, there might have been some damage to areas a little bit outside the frontal lobes, but what makes this person and their case interesting to scientists is the fact that the injury was in the frontal lobes, and as a result of the injury, Gage's personality changed.
Can we tell what kind of personality? I mean, was it an inability to make decisions? Or, it's hard to tell.
It's hard to tell, other than the fact we know it changed. He couldn't resume his former position, although he did work afterwards. I mean,
but he wasn't good as a foreman.
He wasn't good as a foreman, which requires executive skills.
I brought a brain in a box here, and I wonder if you can show me where on the brain the accident.
So this is a model of a brain. It just sounded like he was pulling out an actual brain. Just wanted to give a disclaimer there.
So these are the frontal lobes of the brain. This is the right side and the left side. And the rod probably entered somewhere from the bottom of the frontal lobes on the left side and came out somewhere on the top of the frontal lobes. So all the tissue in between here to here no doubt was damaged, as well as some of the surrounding tissue.
What was the thinking in those days about the relationship of the brain to the personality?
Yeah.
How did they organize their thoughts about that?
Well, there wasn't a lot of sophisticated thinking. Here's an example of such thinking. This is a phrenology skull, and you can see etched into the skull in different places are what might be called faculties.
Phrenology was invented by a very bright fellow called Franz Joseph Gall, who thought that.
So if you ever want to see a phrenology skull, Dr. Jackson has one in his office, which is now over in Clark. But yeah, for a long time, they believed that just by feeling your skull, they could tell a lot about you. And there was a lot of eugenics in this, just heads up, and then proving that other races were inferior, quote unquote.
The different parts of the brain did different things. His mistake was in believing bumps in the skull reveal what lies beneath. Has any one of these areas shown to confirm? You don't even have categories
Alan,
like
it was
this
a
anymore.
crapshoot.
Yeah,
You know?
I mean benevolence. Nobody's looking for benevolence in the brain, right? Or are
We're
they?
all looking for benevolence, but not right now in the brain.
Reasoning faculties he's got over here.
So that's probably not a bad place to have it. There's probably some relationship between the functions of the frontal lobe and your ability to do certain kinds of reasoning.
He's got language under the left eye.
Yeah.
Is that possible? Is there? Is that possible? Why would he say that? Is there brain under the left eye?
I don't know what kind of plaster cast he was studying in order to do that. There's no under the left eye is your left cheek.
Gall may have been wrong in the details, but his concept of the brain as an organ with specialized regions has been vindicated. And of all the specialized regions, none is more important in distinguishing us from the rest of the animal kingdom and from our pre-human ancestors than the enormously enlarged front part of our thinking brain, the frontal lobes or prefrontal cortex.
It serves as sort of the central executive, the chairman of the board of the brain.
Again, that was a little confusing. Frontal lobes are like the whole part here. Prefrontal cortex is the very front part of it. So they're not the same thing. The prefrontal cortex is part of the frontal lobes.
And it helps guide our behaviors. It helps us plan. It helps us carry out plans. It helps us reason about difficult topics. It helps us make certain kinds of decisions. It helps us inhibit behaviors that are not really appropriate, more primitive behaviors. For example, let's say you want to be on a diet and you love chocolate, and in front of you you see this wonderful, delicious chocolate cake,
right.
But you know you shouldn't have it.
Right.
Well, the frontal
the back of my brain is
wants it,
and the front of my brain
is saying
right.
not good for me.
Right.
And so you're able to put it off because you have another goal. Maybe the goal is to lose weight.
Yeah.
Maybe the goal is to live longer.
Right.
So these goals are going to be much more important than this sort of short-term goal based on just seeing that chocolate cake
Right.
in front of you.
Join Planet Fitness for...
Alrighty. So that gives us some context for good old Phineas here. Throw the captions back on here. There we go. And so I have a little more backstory on him. So he was not that much taller than me. He was only 5'6". I'm wearing about 2-inch wedges today, so I'm Phineas height today. He was 25 years old. He was a foreman of the Rutland and Burlington Railroad excavating crew, and he was well liked and respected by his workers. He said they said he had an iron will to match his iron frame. A lot of railroad workers were very muscular because of the physically demanding labor. And he was one of those people who was like always healthy. And then this happened on September 13th, 1848 in Vermont, which is where he lived. And so these are the actual words, I believe, of the doctor. Gage was engaged in charging a hold drilled in the rock. So they would put explosives in the rock to blast and make it easier to do things. Sitting at the time upon a shelf of rock above the hole. His men were engaged in the pit a few feet behind him. The powder and fuse had been adjusted in the hole, and he was in the act of tamping it in, as it is called, where they would sort of put it down. While doing this, his attention was attracted by his men in the bit behind him, averting his head and looking over at his right shoulder, at the same time dropping the iron on the charge. So he was supposed to be hitting the rod. He missed because these guys called him, and he hit the charge. So like the script, the way you saw, like he was just sort of like there, and it blasted. That was not it. He was actively involved in it. So, you know, when you strike something that is explosive, it often explodes, right? And so because his head was turned, that's why it went this way, right? It struck fire upon the rock, and the explosion followed, which projected the iron obliquely upwards, passing completely through his head and high in the air, falling to the ground several rods behind him, where it was afterward picked up by his men, smeared with blood and brain. Ooh. The tamping rod itself was 3 foot 7 inches in length, with a diameter of 1 1/4 inches at its base, so not that wide, right? And a weight of 13 1/4 pounds. So this was not, you know, a lightweight bar. It was round and smooth from continued use, and it tapered to a point 12 inches from the end. The point itself was only a 1/4 inch in diameter. And so then we did see this personality change described by people who knew him, the equilibrium or balance, so to speak, between his intellectual faculties and animal propensities. This is very much the language of the time, right? Seems to have been destroyed. He is fitful, irreverent, indulging at times in the grossest profanity, which was not previously his custom, manifesting but little deference for his fellows, impatient of restraint or advice when it conflicts with his desires, at times perniciously obstinate, yet capricious and vacillating, devising many plans of future operations which are no sooner arranged than they are abandoned and turned for others, appearing more feasible. A child in his intellectual capacity and manifestations, he has the animal passions of a strong man. Previous to his injury, although untrained in the schools, he possessed a well-balanced mind and was looked upon those who knew him as a shrewd, smart businessman, very energetic and persistent in executing all his plans of operation. In this regard, his mind was radically changed so decidedly that his friends and acquaintances said he was no longer Gage. And so that's one of the big quotes that they use. Now, the really interesting thing, as the doctor said in this thing, is Gage did keep working. He did not work. He tried to go back to work as a foreman. It went horribly. He was fired because of his erratic behavior and his altered personality. So what he did is he started traveling around New England, and he went to Boston. He visited New York, and while he was in New York, he actually did a brief stint at Barnum's sideshow. So the Barnum of Barnum and Bailey, the circuses. People would pay, I don't know, a shilling, a penny, whatever it was then, to go in and see him, and he would sit with the rod and let himself be looked at. He eventually returned to work at a livery stable in New Hampshire. So if you're not familiar with what that is, that's a stable with like carriage horses. He would take care of people's horses who came in. They talked about in the video how he like got this affinity with animals. And he did that for quite some time. And one of the things I've seen about this is like working with animals in that capacity, right? Does take a lot of abilities, right? You've got to be, horses are flight animals, right? They're prey animals. So you've got to be able to work with them in a very gentle way. Hooking up things is very complex for these carriages, right? And he did that well. So the implication that he just like couldn't function at all is wrong, right? However, in February 1861, he suffered a series of epileptic seizures, leading to a rather severe convulsion at 5 a.m. on February 20th. The family physician unfortunately chose the treatment of choice at the time, which was bloodletting, which is just what it sounds like. So they still at this time believed we had these humors in our body. There were like different types of bile and blood. And so one of the ways to treat people was to literally just take a cut and let some blood come out. And they would do this for fevers, they would do this for all manner of things. Surprisingly enough, it wasn't that effective that often. I know, you're all shocked by that. So, at 10 p.m. on May 21st of the same year, he eventually died, having suffered several more seizures. Although an autopsy was not performed, his relatives donated his skull and the iron rod to the museum, as you saw, at Harvard University. And after the accident, Phineas carried the iron rod with him almost daily. So it was just like a mark of what happened to him, I guess, which is sort of interesting to think about. But so again, like his story isn't fully told in intro textbooks, and I think it's important to know he did work afterwards, right? He just had to sort of change what he did. I have this other video which is really interesting. It's sort of a modern version of something similar happening to someone, and we can see the differences in treatment. I know, again, you're going to be shocked that we didn't do bloodletting and just reaching into someone's head to pull out whatever.
Find your beat, your moment.
In 1861, one of the most celebrated patients in medical history died in San Francisco. His name was Phineas Gage, and 13 years earlier...
Yeah, I should say he also traveled quite a bit. Like, I think at one point he was working in South America, and then here you see he was in San Francisco. So again, to be able to travel those long distances, right, that does take some planning and suggest that he had some mental faculties, right?
Earlier, he'd been the victim of a freak accident. He was buried without autopsy. But in 1994, using computerized brain imaging techniques, the husband and wife team of Hannah and Antonio Damasio performed a virtual autopsy using an electronic scalpel.
So these are the same folks as the last video.
Working with his railroad gang in Vermont, Gage was dynamiting large rocks when a tamping rod, more than a yard long and 1.25 inches in diameter, blasted up through his cheek, behind his eye, and out of the top of his skull. Astonishingly, he survived. He was still intelligent. His language and memory were intact. But he was a radically different person. As his colleagues put it, Gage was no longer Gage. The likable, hard-working, socially responsible character became untrustworthy, used profane language, and lied to his friends. It was as if the rod had destroyed the moral compass in his brain. The Damasios' detective work struck an immediate chord because several of their patients at the University of Iowa were, in a sense, modern Phineas Gages.
We have a large number of patients, neurological patients, who as a result of diseases have damage in certain sectors of the brain. It's a little hard to picture it, but you can think of them especially in the front part of the brain. And when there is damage in those areas, what happens is that patients become unable to read certain social clues out in society. So they will have difficulty picking up the significance of a facial expression or the significance of, for instance, a shrugging of the shoulders. And likewise, those patients will also not be able to perform in relation to what is expected in terms of the social contract.
You see those okay, Joe?
Meet Joe. Until a stroke in 1989, he was a high-energy, creative outdoorsman with a cheerful, fun-loving personality.
And I want to kind of point this out that, you know, this guy had a stroke. Gage had a traumatic brain injury, right? An open head one. And so this is a really important facet that it matters more where the damage is than what caused the damage, essentially, in terms of like the brain functions that are affected by it.
Now, according to his wife, Dee, he's always in neutral.
A windmill.
This experiment gets to the heart of Joe's problem.
A woman and a little boy.
The electrodes are recording his skin conductance response, a measure of his emotional state.
Picture of a skinny man.
How's skin?
Awful skinny. Somebody ice skating. There was a man burning himself.
Typically, people generate a strong skin conductance response to the disturbing pictures, but not to the routine, bland ones. And yet, no matter what the picture, Holocaust victim or smiling child, Joe's response is flat, outside and in. Intellectually, he understands what he's seeing, but emotionally, he doesn't connect. Like Phineas Gage, Joe has lost key components of his social brain. The evolved mechanisms that, behind the scenes, smoothly process and integrate reason and emotion have been damaged.
The goal of the game is to guess at which decks you can make the most money off of.
To test his ideas about the social brain, Damasio uses experiments designed with his colleague Antoine Béchara. They're called the gambling experiments.
In front of you, there are 4 decks of cards.
You're hooked up to a polygraph machine and told to keep turning over cards from any of the 4 decks.
I'll give you some money each time you select a card.
With every card, you win play money. 2 of the decks pay $100, but they have an unexpected sting in the tail. You might have to pay the experimenter, sometimes as much as $1,250.
So you owe me $200.
With the other 2 decks, you win only $50, but the possible penalty is much smaller, less than $100 on average. The goal of the game is to make as much money as you can, so it has some of the same elements as the game of life. Uncertainty, some risk, punishment and reward, and a blend of reasoning and intuitions.
You win $50, but you lose 50, so it's even.
Initially, I did what most people do, favor the 2 high-paying decks. That is, until the experimenter started demanding big penalties.
So you owe me $50.
Having learned my lesson, I eventually curbed my gambling impulses and shuffled over to the safety of the other 2 low-payment, low-punishment decks.
You win $100.
Typically, over 100 plays, a normal subject will retreat to the safer decks about 70% of the time. Damasio's frontal lobe patients do the exact opposite. By halfway through the game, they're often bankrupt, which has happened to some of them in real life following their brain damage. Now, how can their judgment, their prediction of future consequences, be so disastrous? Damasio believes there may be a tantalizing clue in the polygraph responses. As the game went on, my graph showed a new trace that wasn't there at the beginning. I had the usual response after each penalty or reward, but I also began to develop a response just before picking a card from the risky decks. And that response increased as the game continued.
You win $50, but you lose $25.
In other words, according to Damasio, my brain was gradually learning to anticipate the penalty and sending an alarm signal, a gut feeling, if you like, that could be picked up by the polygraph.
And this is sometimes referred to as anticipatory anxiety.
The phrase gut feeling is actually a very good one. It just shows that people have been very wise for millennia in spotting the fact that some of their choices are very closely connected to emotions, and they're very closely following on emotions. In other words, the gut feeling is a marker for something that ultimately may be good or bad.
Now here's the key finding. None of Damasio's patients showed this anticipatory response. The neural networks that allow gut feelings about good or bad outcomes to guide rational decision-making are damaged. There's a break in the complex feedback loop of circuits that underpin reason and emotion. And so there's no way to make appropriate social judgments, and no way for the system to be calibrated or tuned by experience.
So again, that there are people in this day and age who have similar things going on, I think is really important. But then also that on top of that, there are folks who are really going to have consequences, right? So like if this is how you are treating money, right? Yeah, as they mentioned, you can go bankrupt IRL in real life, right? And again, just like Phineas, imagine you've always been someone who's empathetic and like caring with your family, and now you're not responding right in the same way. That's going to make things really hard and strained on your family. So the frontal lobes are really important to humans for a whole host of reasons. Your book says all neural roads eventually lead to the frontal lobe, so it really is in some ways the central executive of the brain. It's sometimes referred to. And it has different behavioral strategies that it can tell us to do in response to external cues, such as the cards or people around you, but also in response to internal cues from other parts of the brain, from other parts of the body. So there is, and actually I'm gonna try and pull up my diagram here. So give me just a second, just to give you all more of a perspective on this. Okay. But there are different parts of the frontal lobes that do different functions, and in some ways they're more varied than other lobes in the brain, which can, you know, make this an even more complex area. Blank out this again. Yeah, 16. There we go. The internet in this building has been very slow. So there we go. Okay. So this is showing you some of those parts, as is this diagram as well. Just to sort of walk you through some of these. So it's going, the prefrontal cortex itself, that very front of the brain that does a lot of the stuff that makes us really human. It gets input from the dorsal medial nucleus of the thalamus. Good job. I was like, what is Zoom Captions going to do with this? Good job, Zoom Captions. And there are different divisions, as you're seeing here. So there is the dorsolateral prefrontal cortex. There's the inferior frontal cortex, which is also called the orbital frontal cortex, because why would things just have one name, right? We got to make it more confusing. There's the medial frontal cortex, which is linked with the cingulate in the brain as well. And so what functions are these serving? They're controlling cognitive processes, so that we do the right things at the right time. And this can mean not only, you know, just thinking about behavior more abstractly, but also literally communicating to the motor cortex and telling us, do this thing, don't do this thing, right? So it becomes very important, that link there. It's also really linked to important internal cues, particularly memory, and in particular, temporal memory, which is a memory for what just happened. All right, and then that lets us react. In fact, I think if I go down, yeah, this, you can kind of see some of the places where the prefrontal cortex and the motor areas of the brain are connecting in this diagram. external cues that it's going to react to as well include feedback about the rewarding properties of stimuli. That links it directly, right, to what they were just talking about in that video of like, if I'm gonna get even play money, right, as a reward, my brain is gonna react in certain ways to that. You know, we know just from the basic principles of learning that if we're reinforced for a behavior, we're more likely to do it again. If we're punished for a behavior, we're typically less likely to do it again, more likely to avoid doing it. And it's also linked to the orbital frontal cortex, where we do learning by association. That same area of the brain is linked to social interactions. Because humans are a pack animal, right? We are people who enjoy being around other people. I mean, most of the time, right? We all have those days where we don't want to be around anybody, fully acknowledging that, right? But social interactions in and of themselves can be rewarding, right? And social cues are very important for us to know and acknowledge and understand. And then there's autonoetic awareness, which is our self-knowledge and self-awareness. And it binds together the awareness of yourself as a continuous thing through time, right? So this links to your autobiographical memory of who am I, how do I respond in certain situations, how have I reacted to other people in my life, for example. And so, as I was mentioning, it's linked to the motor cortex, which projects to the spinal motor neurons, and the cranial nerves that control the face, right? So again, facial expressions, very important for people. So that makes sense. And then it also projects to other areas we know are linked to movement from our movement chapter earlier, such as the basal ganglia. And things like the red nucleus. The premotor cortex has projections to the spinal cord. It itself also links back to the motor cortex. And it gets projections from the parietal areas and from the dorsolateral prefrontal area. So it's sort of a lot of stuff is going on there. That's the visual set here. Yes, some of the visual stuff. Yeah, thought there were more fun brain diagrams, but they're all up at the front. So I'll go back up to some of this stuff. So again, all linked, all connected, right? And become very important in telling us, do this or don't do this. All right. And again, social cues being a really important part of that. Our eye fields receive data from the superior colliculus. There we go. And so the premotor cortex, therefore, selects the movements that we're going to do, selects the movements to be executed. It functions to choose behavior in response to the external cues. Something as simple as I take walks in the morning around my neighborhood and I see someone waving and I wave back, right? It's my prefrontal cortex that's coordinating everything to have me do that as a social cue. It also there's just said that. And there's an increase in activity in the premotor cortex when the cues become associated with movement in general. So when people have frontal lobe injury, again, whether it's from stroke, from lesions, from some sort of horrific traumatic open head injury like Phineas Gage, or perhaps a traumatic brain injury that's closed head, like, I don't know, hitting your helmet against somebody, right here, which is what happens a lot in not only the NFL, but other contact sports. They're starting to do a lot of research now in European football, soccer, because of the headers. That they're having some of the same symptoms as NFL players. Because of the brain trauma, right? So those folks are going to struggle with things like planning and selection of movements and actions. They will persist. They have a really hard time changing their mind or refocusing at times, and they have trouble ignoring distracting stimuli. And then they'll struggle with memory for what you've already done, because some of that is being hosted up here, as we just mentioned. So this could obviously be a challenge, right? So if we look here, we know that there is lateralization in the frontal lobes, maybe more distinctly than other lobes of the brain. So for example, the left hemisphere being linked more clearly to language, and the right hemisphere being linked more clearly to nonverbal movements and facial expressions. And then, excuse me, we also see that the left seems to be responsible for encoding or saving memories, whereas the right side of the frontal lobe seems to be involved in retrieving memories, getting them out of long-term storage. And you can see some of that breakdown here, right, where when we have verbal things, they're much more effective when people have left hemisphere frontal lobe damage than right hemisphere frontal lobe damage. More movement related things more affected by right hemisphere damage. And then really interestingly, people who have bilateral, so both sides, that are struggling with time orientation. Where am I in space and time? Who am I in space and time? So injuries to the frontal lobes can mess with a lot of different functions, because the frontal lobes do a lot of different functions. So here you can see, and let me pop this into slideshow really quickly, just so you can see it in a little more clear. Just the whole array of things that can be affected here. So disturbance of the motor function. The projector's getting worse. Geez, I'll read it to you. This will include loss of 5 movements, loss of strength, loss of movement programming, poor voluntary eye gaze, so movement related to the eyes, poor corollary discharge, Broca's aphasia is linked up here too. Broca's area is up here. And we know that Broca's is partially related to being able to form words with your mouth, right? Loss of divergent thinking, so they will be less spontaneous, have trouble designing strategies, and we saw that with Phineas Gage, the description of him, right? That he would like come up with a plan and then abandon it and come up with another one. And then environmental control of behavior, they have poor response inhibition, impaired associative learning, risk-taking, rule blanking, those gambling experiments, and then problem with self-regulation. Now, really interestingly, for any of you that have either known someone with ADHD or you yourself have struggled with ADHD or other attentional things, some of this will sound familiar. And that's because there's no damage per se, but people with ADHD, it is in the frontal lobes where a lot of these functions happen. And in fact, one of the frontline treatments for ADHD is stimulant drugs. And people will be like, why would you give someone who's hyperactive a stimulant, right? But the stimulant drugs are essentially programmed to work on your prefrontal cortex, your frontal lobes, to help you do some of this better. The planning, the concentrating, things along those lines. They have poor working memory and delayed responses. They have impaired social behavior, altered sexual behavior, so they will be much more likely to engage in risky sexual behaviors, again, because they don't have that sort of executive of their brain being like, this might not be the best idea. Like, let's wear a condom, maybe, right? They have trouble with olfactory or smell discrimination. And again, damage to the facial area can lead to additional problems here as well. So, and again, if you, for example, have your motor functioning influenced here, loss of those fine movements can appear after damage to the primary motor cortex. The movement programming, your premotor or your dorsolateral cortex. Frontal eye field for those gaze changes. Internal neural signals that movement will occur can be damaged. And then again, we mentioned Broca's area, but then also if you have some damage to the supplementary motor cortex, it's entirely possible that you are unable to make words at all, because it's essentially the parts of your brain that tell you how to make speech. So you will be rendered mute, essentially. I do have a video related to some of these functions that I'm going to go ahead and show here.
Liberty Mutual customized my car insurance, and I saved hundreds. With the money I saved, I started a dog walking business. Oh! Oh no, it's just so funny! Only pay for what you need. Liberty, 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 liberty. Use
Stop a little bit.
Kayak to find the hotel you want at the price you want. Download the Kayak app now.
What happens when those mental processes go awry, when damage to the brain interferes with the normal structure of human thought? In 1983, Bill Mazzal graduated in the top 10% of his law school class and passed the bar exam on the first try.
This time I want you to start with the number 101 and count back by sevens.
Today, he seems normal, but in 1984, a stroke changed his life.
101, 94, 87, 80, 73, 66, 59, 52, 45, 38, 31.
One afternoon in January, I got a phone call from Bill to say something was really wrong. It was an emergency. I needed to come home right away. So I went racing home, and I asked him what had happened, and he told me that he had just been sitting on the couch watching TV when he got this blinding pain in his head and felt very sick and could barely make it to the bedroom to collapse. Turned out to be very bad. Turned out to be an aneurysm. And the aneurysm, as I found out, is a blood vessel that balloons out and starts to bleed, which it did in Bill's head. And it was right in about the frontal lobe area. That's where the bleeding occurred, is in the frontal lobe area.
Right.
It was very sudden, it was very scary, and neither of us had any idea what was happening to us, what was happening to our lives, what was happening to our future.
It may be very hard to appreciate exactly what is wrong with somebody with frontal lobe injury. There have been many studies to try and pinpoint a particular function. And in some ways, it's almost easier to characterize frontal lobe function by saying what it doesn't do. It's not the part of the brain that makes us speak. It's not the part of the brain that allows us to see. It's not the part of the brain that allows us to hear. It's not the part of the brain that allows us to touch something and recognize what that is that we just touched. It's not really by itself the part of the brain that remembers. It doesn't seem to be involved in any particularly discrete perceptual, sensory, or so-called motor function. But in spite of that, it seems to have a very critical role in how we use the kind of information that other parts of our brain are dedicated to determining.
Before the aneurysm, Bill was very organized. He could plan things sort of automatically. He was very much a planner. He could keep a million details in his head. He had an extremely good memory. He was very outgoing, very self-confident, very take charge kind of a person. Following the aneurysm, like now, Bill is still very intelligent, but he doesn't have the capacity anymore to apply that.
Bill retained, after his stroke, all of the knowledge that he had previously, but he lost his ability to problem solve. And in losing his ability to problem solve, which is what lawyering is really all about, he lost his ability to be a functioning lawyer. And, you know, there's nothing more disappointing than finding somebody as bright as he is, working with him for a couple of years, and then, you know, seeing overnight those skills just gone. You know, it really cuts deep when you see that.
Recognize these?
Tinker toys.
Tinker toys. Your job is to make whatever you want with them. Okay, just get started anytime you want.
Because frontal lobe injury causes such subtle problems, psychologists like Muriel Lezak have devised clever ways of evaluating the damage.
In making a construction with Tinker Toys, Bill simply jumped into the task with no plan, no forethought. It had not even occurred to him to have had a goal.
Overall, we're talking about the frontal lobe as an executive brain area that is responsible for integrating information that comes from many different brain systems into a purposeful plan of behavior, anticipating the future, making critical judgments, being able to survey a situation, to juggle ideas, and to choose which idea is most likely to have implications for the future.
Did you have any ideas in your head when you started doing it?
Not really. Well, no. I was going to make two separate things and sort of join them together, but just any two of these together aren't real sturdy, and so I thought I'd get them together earlier.
If thinking is the process of using information to make decisions, then the frontal lobe is crucial for thinking. Without that, without the frontal lobes, we are at the mercy of our environment. We respond to events without reflection. We are unable to plan for our futures. It is this capacity, the ability to plan for the future, that distinguishes us from all other species.
This rhesus monkey has a relatively well-developed frontal lobe. The idea is to see whether he can remember where the food is after his vision is blocked by the screen, whether for him out of sight means out of mind.
If we did not have the ability to keep information in mind when it is no longer in view, we would be responding on the basis of whatever stimulus attracted our attention. The ability to regulate our behavior by internalized knowledge or internalized memories, that is everything that we can keep in mind, allows us to modulate our behavior and to control the outside environment.
The Galago monkey is far more primitive than the rhesus. He finds the food in the left food well the first time it's offered, but without much in the way of a frontal lobe, will he have the capacity to keep the food's location in mind when it's now placed in the right-hand well? The frontal lobe may be the most highly evolved area of the brain, and it seems to be the last area to develop in children.
You all, unless you are already 25, your frontal lobe is still developing. And then you hit 25 and you immediately start cognitive decline. Woohoo! So I remember when my neuropsych professor told me that in grad school, we were all like, great, because we were all like 25, 26 at that time.
At 7 months old, Caitlin's brain is still undergoing profound change. Like all children her age, her frontal lobes function more like those of a Galago than a rhesus. Even the slightest distraction causes her to lose track of the food. It will be years before her frontal lobes are functioning at an adult level.
Of course, when we say that the frontal lobe is crucial for thinking, we do not mean that the frontal lobe carries out this process independently of other structures in the brain. It carries out these processes through its connections with other centers, through its connections with the sensory centers, where information from the outside world is formed, and with the memory centers, where information is stored, and with the motor centers, where the final decision to act is taken.
To think, then, is to activate an entire network of nerve cells that link areas throughout the brain.
So again, that's why it's referred to as the CEO of the brain, because it's connected to all the other pieces and it's telling them, hey, do this. Hey, don't do this. Hey, do this. Hey, let's all work together to get this done, right? And again, you saw when you lose your frontal lobe, you lose some of those abilities that we think of as like higher functioning, like that guy just couldn't be a lawyer anymore because he couldn't think through analytical issues in the same way. All right, we'll go ahead and we'll end a few minutes early today. On Wednesday, I know it's right before break, but please come because we are going to work through the case study. Anyone who didn't turn in their exam yet, please make sure that I get it. Again, folks on Zoom, make sure that you stick it under my door before break.